welcome to today's edition of Newsnight. My name is Joel Senyonyi. In his address to Uganda's parliament, President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya raised a couple of things. One, he talked about democracy. We need to up that. He talked about youth unemployment, another challenge that is eating us up. Well, Kenya too. But he also talked about corruption, saying, look, if we do not address the issue of corruption, we are doomed. Was this expected in his speech? Joining me as always, Andrew Mwenda. Andrew, you castigated Obama when he raised the question of democracy. You said, look, this man cannot come here and begin to lecture us on democracy and so on. President Kenyatta raised the same issues, saying, look, if we do not address the question of democracy, it's going to eat us up economically, talking about especially allowing the opposition to have their way too. And I thought, okay, Andrew should be excited.
I don't know what
that is coming from a fellow black, because you saw the other one being a Muzungu, he cannot come here and lecture us.
I don't know whether Obama is a Muzungu, he considers himself a black person, but what I would say is that I actually think that you cannot teach a country to be a democracy. The country learns to be a democracy through its own internal political contestations. So if you feel there are gaps on democracy in Uganda, you don't need to wait for Sunday service, you don't need to do anything, you need to join politics and struggle, whether in the media, whether in the courts, on the streets, wherever it is, contribute to the building of your democracy. No one is going to build democracy for Africans except Africans.
Yeah, and whoever,
yes, perhaps he should do better to improve democracy in Kenya, because what I see in Kenya, of course, Kenya is much more democratic than the United States. A lot of you Africans think that America is a democracy. America is an oligarchy. America is an oligarchy of corporations where elections are held to create an illusion that people have control over the state, when the state has effective control over the population of that country.
But you know where I disagree with you, Andrew, when you say that, look, we cannot talk about these things and so on. I'm thinking, no, we should actually keep talking about them, keep reminding these leaders that, look, it's important, you know, that you listen to people. Just because I do not agree with you. I think it's Plato that once said, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it. And that's what Kenyatta is saying. Look, listen to the opposition. They are Ugandans too in this case.
Well, I would put it in a better way for Kenyatta. I think that the opposition and the government need to listen to each other. It's not the government just to listen to the opposition. It should that the politicians in Uganda need to listen to each other. They always need to find positions of accommodation and compromise. What I see in Uganda is that Museveni is always torn to the extreme by his own supporters, and Besigye is torn to extreme by the other supporters, by his own supporters. I do not know whether you know that I and Conrad Nkutu tried to organize a discussion.
I remember that. Yes. It flopped miserably.
And it did not flop because of the Museveni side, by the way. I'm always very sorry to say this. It flopped because Besigye was unable to enter these negotiations, fearing that his supporters...
Besigye seems to say a different issue altogether. But anyway, we'll handle that at a particular time.
But I thought, from what he told me when I met in the meeting, he was afraid that his supporters will misunderstand him. President Museveni invited Lukwago for a meeting. I went to Lukwago's home to see him. Lukwago told me he cannot meet President Yoweri Museveni because his supporters will think he has been bribed.
Are you sure if we asked Lukwago he would say that?
I have said it here before.
Do you have recordings of this?
I went to Lukwago's statement. It was even published in the Independent. It is not that Lukwago was lying about it. He said, look, if I try to go and see Museveni, my supporters will say he has compromised me. So if you are afraid that your supporters will misunderstand you, then you cannot have dialogue. But let me tell you, you cannot build democracy with one side speaking to another.
Both need to listen to each other. Let's talk unemployment, Andrew. Look, in Kenya, youth unemployment is to the tune of 70% of the youth population. In Uganda, it's about 83%. And Kenyatta says, look, if we do not nip this in the bud, it's going to eat our dinner. How do we address this challenge? I didn't quite hear him offer solutions.
I don't know how these people calculate youth unemployment. I need to know, but I think that most Ugandans who are employed, or in Kenyans who are employed, are not employed in the formal sector. They are employed in the informal sector. So how you determine youth unemployment, especially where you have many youth employed in agriculture and the informal sector, I do not know. But what I can say is that if East African and African countries want to cure the problem of youth unemployment, they must go into manufacturing of low-skill, low-value products, whether they are textiles, toys, shoes, and things like that. And to develop such manufacturing industry, you have to have government support to private enterprises in the form of government subsidies, in the form of tax rebates.
Do you see that here?
I don't think that the political process we have in Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania and all other African countries can accept Ethiopia and Rwanda, where the state enjoys a higher degree of legitimacy and they're the most authoritarian states in Africa, you would say. Other than Ethiopia and Rwanda, I don't see these other more democratized countries doing it. Because you see what it requires is that the government must use public money by giving it to private investors, whether it's in form of subsidies, cheap loans, or tax rebates, in order for them to be attracted to invest in manufacturing. Government must create incentives that make it possible for you to reduce your risk to invest in manufacturing. Manufacturing is the only sector that I know that will do that. The second sector, of course, is agriculture. Now, the investment in agriculture to create jobs, I don't know how, because if you make investments in agriculture, you must promote agricultural modernization, in which case, for a small acreage of land, you should be able to produce a lot out of it. So agricultural modernization requires to the mechanization and technologization of agriculture, which reduces the number of jobs you can create there.
All right. Finally, the question of corruption. Corruption is another deleterious evil to us and to Kenya, and he talked about that too. But you see, from where I see there's a lot of talk about fighting corruption by our president, every State of the Nation address, etc., but there's a paucity when it comes to action. We do not see that. That's what I see. What do you see?
So let me make everybody angry, because I don't want to speak in order for people to approve of me. I have spent the last 25 years of my life studying economic history, and there is no evidence in economic history that corruption in any way undermines economic growth and development.
Are you listening to yourself?
Yes. So there is no evidence that corruption is an impediment to economic development. In fact, if you look at countries, you see, the argument against corruption is a moral argument. It's not a practical economic argument.
No, but you see, also, you're not able to push through development that should happen, things that must be done. Why? Because you're not getting a kickback. So you end up going with something that doesn't really work for the economy.
In fact, the other way could also be true, assuming there are very many rules that stop me from establishing a business. And then I can bribe a government official today, and I am able to register a business because I paid a bribe. It means that their corruption as a corrective measure, it is correcting institutional dysfunction where it would have taken me 2 years to register a business. It takes me 1 week. The bottom line of what I'm trying to tell you, if you study a country called South Korea and Taiwan, they are the countries that have industrialized the most over the last 50 years. If you study them, you'll find there was as much corruption, if not more corruption, in those countries than here. There was as much corruption.
Maybe they did other things right. That's what
there was as
made
much,
the economies robust.
There was as much corruption in Suharto's Indonesia, even greater family rule in Suharto's Indonesia, as there was in Mobutu's Congo. Congo failed to transform, Indonesia did so. So the question, Joel, therefore, is, the fundamental question in political economy is, under what circumstances is corruption destructive to an economy? And under what circumstances...
So you're saying sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good.
Or maybe it may be a neutral factor which does not affect fundamentals.
Your thoughts on corruption are interesting, but we'll pick it up some other time. We really have to. That will do for today's edition of Newsnight.